bem-vindos. No meio das férias, essa atividade na Faculdade de Direito, mas é uma grande ocasião para nós, essa semana, receber na Faculdade de Direito o pesquisador, cientista político, autoridade pública da Malásia, o Sr. Tunku Zain, e eu vou imediatamente passar para o inglês para receber o nosso hóspede. Welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure for us to host in our Faculty of Law, in a partnership with the Center for Asian Studies of the UFMG, the Embassy of Brazil, to host Mr. Tunku Zain Al-Abidine, that is the president and founder of the think tank Ideas, that holds for Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs in Malaysia. And he will give us a lecture today, a very important lecture about democratic transition in Malaysia, a case study for the Muslim world. For us, it's a great honor to host you and to have you here these days with us. I can announce that we have some good cooperation putting forward with Malaysia for the next years and next months. And for us, it's a great pleasure to host Mr. Tunku Zain for this conference. I thank you very much for your presence in this rainy day on the middle of vacation, but I'm assure you that it's going to worth it. Mr. Tunku Zain, thank you very much for being here with us. The floor is yours, and then we have some discussion. Please.
Thank you very much. And
as you prefer. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Lucas, for inviting me here, and Bom dia. Thanks for coming on, as Professor said, raining during vacation, so it's very encouraging for me that there are so many Brazilian students who want to have an idea about Malaysia. This is my first time here in Brazil, in the whole of South America. This is my first time. And my first time in Brazil, and my first time, of course, in Belo Horizonte. And I've had an amazing time so far. The hospitality has been amazing, and the food I've very much enjoyed. But I've seen many different aspects of Brazil in my 1 week, because I arrived in Carnival, and I went to see the Bloco. So this is different, but I really appreciate this. I'm going to talk today about democratic transition in Malaysia, and I hope we can discuss why this is of interest to Brazil as well. One of the reasons why I'm here is the relationship between Brazil and Malaysia is undergoing a lot of upgrading right now. There is cooperation on environmental issues. There is now, your president made a very strong statement on Palestine, and in Malaysia we have a very strong view as well on Palestine. So this is one area where the relationship is gaining notice. Of course, Brazil is going to be chair of the G20, and this is of course of interest to the whole of the developing world. And trade is continuing to thrive between Brazil and Malaysia. But the other thing which is interesting is the institutional similarities and the institutional journey that can be seen in both countries. From an outsider point of view, we see that Brazil has had this debate about the importance of institutions, the influence of populism in politics, and what this means on institutions that have been established by your constitution. And in the same way in Malaysia, we've had this debate as well about what it means that we have our constitution, and what it means now that we're becoming, or that we want to have more democracy in our socio-political system. So let me start by rewinding and starting from a historical perspective, because I appreciate, has anyone been to Malaysia? Yet? No? Okay. So,
Not yet.
not yet. Well, I hope that will change, especially with some of the partnerships that we are talking about. Because I'm here representing my think tank, Ideas, but also representing a Malaysian university which is trying to expand some partnerships. Now, Malaysia is a federation, like Brazil. So we have 13 states, and these states have their own history. Each state have their own history, and a nice place to begin is in 1511, when we had a colonial power that you are familiar with, Portugal, came to Malacca and decided to colonize Malacca. And so this began the colonial relationship, the colonial experience in what is now present-day Malaysia. The Portuguese conquered Malacca, and then there was a transfer to the Dutch, and then the British came in and established treaty relations with some of the other states of what is now Malaysia. And through this experience, what was a series of Muslim, Malay kingdoms or sultanates began to have changes in culture, in cuisine, in language, but most of all in institutions. And by the time of the 1800s, 1850s, in the Malay states, you have concepts, British concepts of British administration. And of course, the economy is entirely plugged into the colonial economy, where rubber, of course, thank you for the rubber. It is the British who brought the rubber seed from Brazil and put it in Malaya, and you stopped making rubber, and we became the #1 rubber producer. But today we trade all commodities now, so I hope there is some balance. But so there is this legacy of colonial administration and colonial institutions that mixed together with the traditional institutions of the Malay Sultanate. And this continues right up to World War II, when, of course, the Malay states on the British side, but the Japanese on the German side come and invade Malaya, and of course the war ends with the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so the Japanese surrender and the British come back. And then there is this debate about what should the post-World War II, post-colonial country look like. And so there is this debate in Malaysia, and I think our process of decolonization in Malaysia, or in Malaya at the time, is different from the experience in other parts of Asia and the experience in most parts of Latin America, where the removal of the colonial power was often very violent and often involved a lot of death. In the case of Malaya, our independence from the British took the form more of negotiations, and so 10 years after the end of World War II, we have a proposal of a federation where these different states will come together as a federation of Malaya, and we will have things like a parliamentary democracy, so a two-chamber system. The upper house is supposed to serve the states, just like in Brazil, and the lower house is to serve on a population basis, according to the first-past-the-post electoral system. We are going to have an independent judiciary. We are going to have, in the federal constitution, guaranteed rights and freedoms, fundamental liberties. of expression and right to life. And also, we are going to enshrine the idea of the constitutional monarchy. So I mentioned earlier that each of the states had their own kings, and they each one had the treaty with the British. So now they all come together to have a federation, but there will be one king for the whole country that is rotational. So every 5 years, the king comes from one of the states on a rotated basis. But there is also the elected government alongside that. And in each state as well, each state will have the king, but also an elected assembly and a chief minister. And of course, the competencies between the federation and the states is defined, again, by the federal constitution. So this is the agreement that was made in 1957, and there is a slight expansion. 8 years later, 7 years later, in 1963, the federation is expanded. So in Malaya, you have the peninsula, but then you have Singapore at the bottom, and you have Sabah and Sarawak, two other states across the South China Sea. So in 1963, these three other states, together with the federation earlier, combined together to make the country Malaysia. So this is the 11 states of the peninsula, plus Singapore, plus Sabah, plus Sarawak. So this is the new Malaysia. But 2 years later, in 1965, Singapore was removed from the federation. And that is another lecture, if you want to talk about the reasons why Singapore becomes an independent country. But this is interesting in political history, that Singapore is a country that receives independence against its will. It did not want to become independent, but it becomes independent. And this is something that all international lawyers should also study. So that brings us to sort of the constitutional settlement of why Malaysia is created. And the next few decades, we see instances of elections. We see there is a communist insurgency. So a lot of the energy of the new country is spent on defeating the communists. So again, you must remember that the relationship with the colonial power is very unique, because we're very friendly, and the colonial power, we are part of the Commonwealth, and there is this big communist activity in Southeast Asia, especially in Vietnam. But in Malaysia, there is this bombings and terrorist activity, but it's the Commonwealth that helps to bring the military to defeat the communists, and at the same time, there is the strategy of economic development that is being pursued. Now, one of the biggest things I have not yet mentioned about this country, Malaysia, is its multi-racial and multi-religious aspect. When the Portuguese came in 1511, Malacca was already quite a cosmopolitan place. The government is run by Malays, but there are Chinese, and there are Indians, and there are Arabs, and people, traders from all over. But what the colonial economy did, especially under the British, was to change the demographic makeup of the land, in which the administration, the government of the land, would be left to the ethnic Malays, who are Muslim, but a lot of the commerce and industry would be dominated by the Chinese, and a lot of the plantation work would be done by Indians, and it would be the colonial policy to encourage migration from China and from India in order to support these colonial objectives. And so therefore, at independence in 1957, and again in 1963 with Malaysia, you have a situation of a country which is very racially divided and racially aware of itself. And so looking at the threat of racial violence, there were special things written into the constitution and into the policies to try and mitigate the conflict that might occur between the Malays and the Chinese and the Indians primarily. But there are also indigenous people in the peninsula and the native people in Sabah and Sarawak. So a lot of the institutions of the country are designed to prevent racial disharmony. Unfortunately, this was not entirely successful. The early economy, although there was economic growth in the 1960s, in the 1970s, there was also increasing ethnic tension. And in the late 1960s, we had a racial riot in which the ethnic Malays and the ethnic Chinese did have violent incidents, and this led to the imposition of emergency law and military rule for some time. And so it took a lot in order to prevent such racial violence from happening again. The government at the time, the Prime Minister at the time, decided to move away from the very pro-democratic and pro-capitalist, anti-communist flavor of the constitution and say, no, we need to have more aggressive policies to empower the ethnic Malays, the ethnic Muslims. And so this was a big change in the mindset of the politics. And this is arguably what then created Malaysia for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Under the administration of Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir, this policy was taken to its ultimate peak, in which a new middle class of ethnic Malays was created using this affirmative action policy. And so it would be very explicit. For example, at university admission would be made easier if you are ethnic Malays. Access to jobs, access to even housing, you would get a discount if you were ethnic Malay and you wanted to get your new house. And entire new industries, the automotive industries, infrastructure, the creation of highways, of ports, of airports. A lot of these industries were given ostensibly to ethnic Malay professionals to manage and to grow. But in reality, with increased political cooperation between politicians and business, a lot of these beneficiaries were not just ethnic Malays, but ethnic Malays with the political connections. And this resulted in what we now call crony capitalism, where yes, there is industry, there is growth of the economy, but through businessmen, through elites, which are selected through the political elites as well. And the important thing to mention is that political competition at this time is low, because the ruling party, the Barisan Nasional, or National Front Alliance, which won independence back in 1957, continually won all of the elections and dominated parliament with over 2/3 majority on almost every occasion. And so the Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir, essentially could do what he wanted. A lot of the executive power was not only within cabinet, but concentrated more and more to him, because nothing could be challenged in parliament. And other institutions, with this increasing centralization of power, a lot of the checks and balances of the constitution were also eroded. So the decentralization of the federal system also was eroded, because in effect, in each of the state assemblies, the same party would win. And so it was the prime minister at the center who would determine who is the chief minister at every level. The power of the media was also curtailed. So in some cases where there was some authoritarian crackdown on political opponents, and the media would comment on it, that also changed with new laws such as the Printing, Press and Publication Act, laws such as the Sedition Act, which is a British-era act to put people in jail without trial indefinitely. So these were the tools available to the Prime Minister at the time. And so despite this, to the outside world, Malaysia continued to be a very successful economic model. We had GDP growth in the 80s and early 90s, GDP growth 7-8% a year, which is a miracle, right? For so many countries. I mean, today, forget it, right? You cannot even conceive of that. But even in the 80s and 90s, Malaysia is seen as one of the Asian tiger economies, and you can see new cities and new airports and all these new buildings. The Petronas Twin Towers, which are iconic, these are the fruits of all of that economic growth. But this model became unsustainable, because what happens when you have enjoyed all this political patronage is that everyone wants to have the same privilege and power after that. And so after Mahathir stepped down, there was another prime minister, Abdullah Badawi, who was more of a reformist. And during his time, some of the civil society space did expand, which is very, very important. And we will come to that later. But nonetheless, he was unable to control the forces that were now beyond, had gone wild. This cooperation between the political elites and the business elites. Every time there is a new contract for a government project, there is no such thing as competition and open tender. And so it became the case that a lot of these projects would be awarded, and if in the past, the work got done and was of good quality, over time, the projects would be granted, but the quality would not be as good. And ultimately, Badawi resigned and was replaced by Prime Minister Najib. And Prime Minister Najib is probably the one, if you have heard of any Malaysian Prime Minister in your generation, you would have heard maybe of Mahathir and of Najib. Why would you have heard of Najib? Because Najib inherited all of that concentration of power that Mahathir had already accrued through his, concentration of power over the decades. And he decided to ultimately use that power to get involved in a mega scandal called the 1MDB scandal. Now, this had wonderful, noble intentions at the beginning to create a sovereign wealth fund that would invest in Malaysia, that would invest in funds, and the revenues would come back to Malaysia to invest in infrastructure and so on. Unfortunately, a lot of these funds were simply stolen, and again, this is a topic of another lecture, but if you go on Netflix or on YouTube, you can find many documentaries that explain how is it that Najib and one of his advisors, Joe Low, basically used this fund as a vehicle to gain loans that were then used on parties with Paris Hilton and the like. And you can find all of this online. But that was the downfall of Najib. That scandal enabled Malaysia and Malaysians to see that the country's wealth was not being used, not being invested in the country, but being wasted elsewhere. And ultimately, the key lesson is, how did this damage the institutions of the country? It damaged the institutions of the country because of the attempt to cover up the scandal and to stop the Prime Minister from being charged. And so we have the case where the Attorney General is dismissed. We have the case where the Anti-Corruption Commission is dismissed. We have the case where journalists trying to talk about this issue are also being silenced. And we have cases where lawyers investigating this have disappeared. And indeed, there was a lawyer who mysteriously died during this time. There are other scandals as well which happened at this time involving the Prime Minister. The wife of the Prime Minister was very famously very, very wasteful and spending a lot of money on handbags and shoes. And this sort of image was known, and this is the spread. Social media is coming up at around this time. And so there are attempts also to censor the internet for all of these things. So the long story short is that the institutions of the country are being damaged because of these scandals and these issues. Now, one of the defenses when a leader is being attacked and is on the run is to use the populist route. And we see the rise of populism in politics everywhere. I think as Brazilians, you understand this very well. But even in established democracies, in the United States, we have seen the rhetoric of Donald Trump and how that is very different to the political debates and competitions that the United States is traditionally known for. Across Europe, you've seen the rise of extremist populism as well, and a lot of the rhetoric centers around race and religion and refugees and minorities. And this is the same thing in Malaysia. When a leader feels attacked and under threat, the easiest thing to do is to use the racial debate and to say, we are under attack by the other, this is a conspiracy, we must defend our identity against the other identity. And so the deterioration of institutions has this direct impact, this correlation on the increase of the racial and religious rhetoric as well. And this is extremely, extremely dangerous in Malaysia, where, as I mentioned earlier, a few decades ago, we already had a case of racial violence. And so the story of Malaysia in the last 10 years, in terms of trying to maintain our democratic institutions, has been not an easy one. So my think tank, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, is now 14 years old. So we came in, I mentioned after Mahathir, there was this Prime Minister Badawi who was a bit more reformist, and he opened the space for civil society. That enabled my think tank to come into being. And we were the first think tank, the first public policy institute that was truly independent, not aligned to government and not aligned to political parties. And so it's very important to understand that that period of time enabled all these think tanks to come up and become part of Malaysian democratic society. Because before that, there was no real opposition to the government in Parliament or even outside Parliament. So we're very proud of that achievement. And when Najib came into office and the details of 1MDB started to emerge, civil society was a very crucial space for these debates to be had. And of course, we were very back then, and now we're very happy to have the support from our foreign embassies as well. It's very, I think, to have a stake in a country is not just the locals, but locals and also in partnership with friends from other countries who believe in democracy and freedom of expression as well. And so this civil society space has allowed the counterbalance to this racial and religious rhetoric. When the general election was due in 2018, there was a huge civil society movement called Bersih. Bersih means clean in the Malay language. And you had rallies, protests, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people on the streets on a very regular basis, demanding more transparency, demanding better checks and balances. And there was a key moment that the previous Prime Minister, Mahathir, who I recall Mahathir is the one who consolidated all the power, he came out to the rally to go against his successor, Najib. And that was a turning point in Malaysian politics, because for the first time, a former Prime Minister was fighting a current Prime Minister. And what happened in the 2018 election is Mahathir managed to defeat Najib in that general election. And for the first time in Malaysian history, there was a transfer of political power. And this is huge in the psychology of Malaysia, because for decades, Malaysians are told, if you change your government, the country will collapse. And so what 2018 did was to show that if you change the government, you don't collapse. It is possible to change your government in a peaceful way, which doesn't result in the collapse of the country. And that's so important today, because now Malaysians can change their government and their psychological barrier is no longer that it would collapse. Unfortunately, what happened with Mahathir is that, was he the great reformer and the changed man that Malaysians thought he would be? It was not the case. He went back after he became Prime Minister. There were some reforms, but in many cases, those reforms did not take place. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the rhetoric on protecting the Malay race and protecting the Malay religion Muslim religion came into force again. So it took another round. It took many different, there were 4 different prime ministers during this time because of the different coalitions that kept changing. There were different coups that occurred. And this is also during COVID. And so the country was quite unstable at the time. But in 2022, it took another reformer, Anwar Ibrahim, to win the election, although with a hung parliament. And that is the Prime Minister we have today. And the same question is being asked. Is he the great reformer that he was supposed to be ever since the 1990s, because in the 1990s, Anwar was the deputy to Mahathir. So there are a lot of interesting personality politics at play here, but I don't think the personalities are what's important to you. I think what's important is to understand the fact that in treating the institutions of a country, you must always bear in mind that however good individual you may have, once they enjoy a concentration of power, you must always be extremely vigilant about the checks and balances that you want to protect. I think in terms of institutions, there is one institution which I have not yet mentioned in this, and this is the monarchy. Again, if you go back to history, the monarchy was always there. And in the federal constitution in 1957 and 1963, the king was never seen to be an institution that had executive power, more an institution that had reserve emergency power. So the power to call a national emergency, the power to call an election or to agree to an election stays with the king. But the king was never seen to be an institution to intervene actively in politics. But that has changed because of what's happened in Malaysian politics. During the time of the political dominance of Mahathir and his party, the royals did not really have a strong role to play because all of the power was unquestioned and unchallenged with Dr. Mahathir. But as there has been more and more political competition, the role of the monarchy has become more visible. For example, after the Hung Parliament, it was the king who had to interview the parties and the members of parliament to determine who really has the majority to become prime minister. And during COVID, for example, the prime minister was seen to want to use emergency powers to use COVID, health as an excuse to clamp down on freedoms. But it was the palace which said, no, hold on, this is not a fair use of the emergency proclamation. And there is another role where the royals have been very important, which is in moderating the ethnic and the religious rhetoric. One of the parties in Malaysia is explicitly use Islam as a platform, the Islamic Party of Malaysia. And they, or an element of theirs, and other elements of society have started to make the argument that Malaysia should become much more Islamic in its flavor. There should be more Sharia law. There should be more punishments like the beheading, and more punishments like chopping off the hands and this sort of thing that you see more in the Middle East. But interestingly, in the Middle East now they are moving away from this. But in Malaysia, we have a section of society which is advocating more and more for this. Now, in Malaysia, the sultans are seen not only as heads of the Malay group, but also as heads of Islam. So they still possess this traditional role as heads of the Muslim religion within the states. And so their voice has been important in moderating this polarizing debate on whether Malaysia should become much more, Islamic in terms of the appearance of the application of the law, Sharia law. So I think that's where I want to maybe stop for now and have a discussion. I hope I've given you some insight a little bit into the history of Malaysia, some of the development of the institutions, the role of civil society, in particular my think tank, which now focuses a lot on institutional reforms, what we're interested in Malaysia is to protect the federal constitution. There are many people who say that Malaysia should become much more Islamic and drop the federal constitution. There's some Malaysians who say we should become much more, very right-wing, or should become very left-wing. But to us, in my think tank, the guiding light must always be the federal constitution, the institutions that it upholds, and until and unless there is a popular agreement to change that arrangement, then that is the arrangement that we must try to defend. And we believe that is the vehicle through which more democratic transition in Malaysia can continue. Maybe one final point. I mentioned that during the Mahathir era, there was one institutional reform that was very important. I want to talk maybe a bit about that. For the first time in 2018, the Speaker of the Parliament was not a parliamentarian. He was a judge appointed from the outside, and this was a manifesto commitment that was made because of civil society. It was think tanks like Ideas which made sure that in the manifesto, one of the promises was that the speaker would be truly professional and independent. And so, although Mahathir was not a changed person and was not a reformist, one reform he did was to appoint this very, very good Speaker of Parliament. And what the Speaker of Parliament did is create the Parliamentary Select Committees. This is huge in Malaysia, because from 1957 until 2018, if you are an MP in Malaysia, you have one role, which is vote with your party when it's the time to vote. But with the Parliamentary Select Committees, for the first time, if you are a backbench member of Parliament, you actually can participate in discussing the bill even before it gets to the chamber. Not only that, you cooperate with members from the other side. And so this has created a new culture in Malaysian politics where MPs are not always opposing each other, but can work together and can become experts and specialists on particular topics. So for example, we now have the Select Committee on Institutional Reforms, you have the parliamentary groups on refugee policy, you have the parliamentary group on political financing, and you have the Select Committee on issues like water and infrastructure. And what this means is that policy making in Malaysia has become a lot more detailed and less political and more oriented to expert advice. And you have university academics coming into Parliament. That never happened before. You have civil society activists coming into Parliament. That never happened before. And so this is a very important reform that has happened. And I think this is another area of cooperation between Brazil and Malaysia, where parliamentarians can come and learn about how best to formulate public policy. So I think I will finish there, and I really hope to have a nice discussion now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Tunku Zain Al-Abdin. This was a fantastic overview with a lot of reflections that serve us here at the Faculty of Law and our university. I think that we have people not from the Faculty of Law here, which is fantastically welcome. And I think that the reflections that Tunku Zain made to us this morning serve us as, first of all, because we are more and more paying attention on what's happening in Asia, and Asia countries become more and more important to Brazil and Malaysia for different reasons, and we have a very good relationship between our countries right now, essentially also due by the strong character of some diplomats. And this is particularly important, and I'm quite happy that we can start the academic year with this reflection and having more a glimpse of the problems that this country have, that we also have, and serve us to reflect on our own problems. For instance, we have a question of the role of the Constitution in the middle of a crisis. I think that you emphasized very much how this Constitution was a specific political pact after a long history of political and international struggles that represents something in the society. And we have the same problem and the same reflection these days in Brazil. The populist rise is a situation that we cannot overlook, and it's happening everywhere, and it has impacts on law, politics, society, parliament, and also on foreign policy. The role of democracy and freedom of speech in this kind of context, and how this democracy and freedom of speech sometimes can be used also to create problems of racial structure, and Brazil doesn't have the same kind of problems than Malaysia in relation to race, but we also have racial problems that are reflected in our public policies, and we need to pay attention to that. And there is also a very interesting fact that perhaps we are not so used to, that is the role of religion in law, the role of the Sharia law, and how this is divided into different 13 states that represent this enormous political pact. And we also have in Brazil, though, problems with religion and the rise of religious groups, some hate speech involving this kind of categories. So we are also facing similar problems these days. And I think that the comparison is a useful tool to understand the other, but also to understand ourselves. And Tunku Zain this morning showed us how this was important to reflect on these topics. The last point that I would stress, and then I will give the floor to you, because you have the opportunity to ask questions, to discuss with intellectual authority and someone that has its own ideas, and I think that you should use this opportunity, so be prepared for raising your hands and asking questions. But the last point that I would like to emphasize that appeared in his lecture is that all these topics, all these divisions, all these different moments also perhaps impact foreign policy. And that's the question that I would like to start the debate here. How do you think that all these divisions, I know that after the 22 election, you have some criticism, some supporters, but how these strong changes of a certain political established position, the long party ruling the country, then new political, how do you think that this was reflected on foreign policy and on perhaps some countries that Malaysia has an allies or have good relationships on Asian countries or with China or the US? Do you think that there is also a challenge on the position that Malaysia wants to occupy in the world, or this is something that already continued since the previous governments?
Well, I think in many ways, we don't have a choice. Malaysia is a small country, right? Our foreign policy is going to be determined by the fact that we are a small, highly open trade country in the crossroads of geopolitics, right? I think regardless of who comes into power in Malaysia and regardless of the rhetoric that is used, we will always be between the US and China and making a play and balancing the two, because the top trading partners are still the US and China. The fact is we still have a very sentimental attachment with Britain, our former colonial power. We are still in the Commonwealth, and so in terms of South China Sea, for example, freedom of navigation, we will always want to see, U.S. warships and British ships to balance the Chinese expansion into the South China Sea. So it is not, to a certain extent, our foreign policy doesn't have much room to maneuver, because that is our reality, and we do not want to be dominated by one or the other. But I think in the day today, a lot of foreign policy is deeply individual. And in the case of Anwar, when he became prime minister, he was someone who had long cultivated this relationship with different leaders across the world. He was very, very close to Erdogan, for example. And so Erdogan was the first foreign leader to congratulate Anwar. But Anwar also had was very close to Al Gore in the US. And to a great extent, Lula and Anwar have this special relationship, which has made the relationship also elevated. And you are right, I should have mentioned at the beginning of my speech, I want to pay tribute to Ari Quintela, the Brazilian ambassador to Malaysia, who has done so much for the relationship and whose office has greatly facilitated my presence here in Brazil. So I think, yes, that's the answer on foreign policy. I think the individual relationships will boost relationships between certain countries, but overall, as a strategy, Malaysian foreign policy cannot move too much.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. The floor is open. Who would like to be the first to ask a question and break the ice for the discussion? Please. Perhaps you would like the micro? Yeah. Okay. Would you please introduce yourself and then ask the question?
Frankly, energy transition is not the hottest. Energy as in energy. Yes. Well, it's not so. It's interesting. I think Malaysians, by attitude, by instinct, understand the need for this transition and decarbonization. But it is not. It doesn't feature hugely in the politics. It's more of a attitudinal thing, like, oh yes, we love our rainforests, of course we must support the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's not live in the politics, and I don't think you have political competition on this matter. You don't have a big debate, for example, between one party and another party about whether we should, the speed at which we should close down our coal power plants. This is not a live issue. I think, like many parts of the developing world, I think most Malaysians will say, while this is important, it's more important that we continue to eliminate poverty. It's more important that we have stability, national unity and stability, rather than talk about this. Having said that, I do know that amongst the environmental NGOs, because my think tank is not an environmental NGO, but of course we have very good links with the environmental NGOs, that yes, of course, there are huge debates and movements towards microgeneration, especially solar for the rural communities. And there is no, and it's accepted. There is no opposition to it. I think the key is, how do you create the economic incentives to make it work? And I think if you have that, it's fine. And you have many pilot projects. So in my state, which is 1 hour south of Kuala Lumpur, there are people, for example, who want to use the mosques. Mosques have this big roofs and lots of land. So to use that to have solar generation, and then to power the villages, right? So this is a wonderful project, and I think this kind of pilot projects are ongoing. We have had some huge hydropower projects before, which has caused some human rights protests, but that's hydro is not, I think for now, there's no project now, right, in Sarawak, that's already done. Yeah, so there is virtually no debate on nuclear. I think we are very skeptical about the need for nuclear because of what happened in Japan, and I think the prevailing mood now is if it can happen in Japan, which is so stringent, we shouldn't try it because it will definitely it will definitely blow up. So I think the focus the answer to your question is that the debate is there, but it's happening quietly and through pilot projects rather than very heated in the political space.
And a follow-up question to that, is there a debate on using the energy transition process to eliminate poverty and to change economic development?
It's a niche debate. It's a niche debate, right? There are a few of these, green, these biotech startups who are talking to this. And to be fair, the ministry, so in my opinion, I didn't ask at the beginning, Professor, is this being streamed and saved? Or?
It's been saved, but we cannot publish it if you want.
Yes, okay. Because I'm being very frank. So in my opinion, one of the better ministries in Malaysia now is the Environment Ministry, because the minister is progressive and innovative, and he, there is no votes. There are no votes from this, right? But he is engaging with a lot of these people who want to have this debate, and I think at this stage, again, it's enabling the pilot projects to happen so that we can move forward and find a better solution. Yeah.
Anyone else? Well, several hands, we can collect some questions. You can start first, please. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Rafael. I'm actually an economics student.
Good.
So I would like to ask, I don't know basically anything about Malaysia. So how does economic inequality correlate with both the rise of populism but also with the racial tensions in Malaysia?
Thank you very much, Rafael. Please. Yeah.
First of all, good morning, sir. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
My name is Matheus. I'm a student here in the Faculty of Law. And something that got a lot of my attention was the fact that in your your abstract of the history of your country, you didn't talk a lot about the judiciary role in the political movements. I would like to know if there was a participation of the judiciary power, and if there wasn't, if there could be a participation of the judiciary power in the following moments.
Thank you very much, Matheus. This is a huge question in Brazil, so
Okay, yes.
it would be nice to hear your thoughts on that, economic quality and judiciary role.
Okay.
And then we pick the other two.
Okay, sure. The populist rhetoric correlates extremely closely with the rise of inequality. So during the period when we had the 7-8% GDP growth year on year, there was no talk about division. There was just this. That is when national unity was at its best. When there was high growth, the messaging from the government is, we are all Malaysian, we have a shared prosperity together, we have this vision together. In fact, there was this policy formulated in the 1990s called Vision 2020 by the Prime Minister at the time, Mahathir. And he delivered this wonderful growth, and everyone felt this growth. And if you go back to the popular culture, you see